faculties at the University of Basel and the University of Oslo. And my main fields of research as a sociologist are sustainability, transitions, and religion. So each one separately, but also the combination of both. And I'm going to speak together with Chris today about the combination of both, so religion and sustainability transitions.
Perfect.
So I'm passing to Chris.
Thank you, Jens. Good morning, everyone. So my name is Chris Ives. I am an interdisciplinary sustainability scientist, but I'm based in a School of Geography at the University of Nottingham in the UK. My interests are quite broad and varied. I started my career in ecology and natural science, but have moved much more into environmental social science and sustainability science. And I'm interested in ideas of systems change for sustainability, but particularly the role of values, beliefs, and worldviews in mobilizing or constraining transformative change. And so you might be wondering how Jens and I are together here today delivering this seminar in a joint capacity. It might be worth just outlining very briefly how that came about. So some years ago, with my interest in this topic of religion and sustainability transitions, I reached out to Jens because of his work from a sociological standpoint on this topic. And so we had an interesting dialogue at an event at the Royal Geographical Society in London. Then following that meeting, we've continued to collaborate on a few different projects. And today we will be presenting some of our most recent thinking about this topic of religion, how it plays into this field of sustainability transitions, but particularly how we can grapple with some of the complexity that is present within this concept of religion. Okay, over to you, Jens.
So the goal of today's seminar is to provide you with an overview of the role of religion in sustainability transitions. And for this, we will start with a case example that illustrates this role a bit to you. And from this case example, we move to the question of why religion has actually so far been mostly neglected in transition studies. So there's been little focus on this topic, and we go into the question of why there has been so little focus on religion in transition studies. After that, we move to a very difficult question, the question of what is religion? There has been a lot of discussion about this, and we present some definitions of religion and then also working definitions that we use for this seminar. Then we move forward to the very important question of why religion is actually relevant for sustainability transitions. And here we present 3 ways in which religion can be relevant for these processes. And we discuss also the idea of the greening of religions. The greening of religion means that religious communities become more and more engaged in sustainability transitions. And we will provide some examples for this. But there are also some complexities that we will address in the 5th part. So here we will see that the greening of religions and the engagement of religions in sustainability transitions is not always straightforward. This has to do with the tensions within religious communities when it comes to the engagement in these processes. And this has also to do with the fact that religious organizations and actors can assume different roles in these processes. They may not only promote sustainability transitions, but they may also prohibit these processes and block transition processes. And after that, at the end, we come to the discussion of future research directions. And after that, there will be a question and answers session. So with this, we move to the case example. The case example is about El Salvador, so the country El Salvador, and how the Catholic Church prevented gold mining in this country. In 2017, El Salvador legislated a law to ban gold mining from the country. The fact that this law was born is highly surprising because initially, many politicians supported the idea of having the gold mining industry in the country. A crucial player in making this law possible was the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church highlighted the environmental risk related to gold mining. And it mobilized very vast protests in the country. It did so by drawing on its membership basis and on its public credibility. So it mobilized a lot of people to go out on the streets and protest against the gold mining industry. And this finally led the government to legislate this law. This example illustrates very well that religion or religious actors can have a crucial role in sustainability transitions. Having this in mind, there's a question of why this role has so far received so little interest in transition studies. And that's a question that Chris will now address.
Yes, so as Jens mentioned, it's a question that's very much at the forefront of today's seminar. So that is why does it seem that religion has received such little attention within sustainability transitions studies? I think there are two main reasons for this that we'd like to present today. The first is that when you look at the origins of the scholarly field of transition studies, it has originated primarily in trying to understand socio-technical transitions. So an emphasis has been given to the technological innovations, so things like solar PVCs or wind, particularly the mix of energy, or maybe looking at transport transitions. And because of that emphasis on technology, there's been a downplaying or a slight overlooking of the role of culture. And that's starting to be rectified within some of the literature, but it's a far more recent move within this field. And then the second point that is most salient here, I think, is looking at the geographical origin of some of this research that has emerged within transition studies. Some of the early writings and even today, a lot of the dominance of literature within this field continues to focus on Western Europe. And as with every geographical location, there are very particular histories and socio and cultural contexts that need to be understood. And so in Western Europe, we can understand this part of the world as being post-Christian, and it is one of the most highly secular parts of the world. And because of that, the role of religious institutions has sometimes not been quite as visible. I put a little footnote here, which is something which we could discuss in the Q&A if that's of interest, but I'm not suggesting that religion is absent in Western Europe. There's some really fascinating trends that seem to be occurring in terms of the shifts of religiosity and the importance of spirituality in Western Europe, but it is a very distinct part of the world, which we suggest has perhaps led to some oversight here of the huge role that religion does play in many parts of the world. We can't really move much further in this talk without tackling this central but quite thorny question of what religion actually is. What is the definition of religion? Before we present a working definition for today's talk, I think it's important to mention that there is a spectrum of approaches to defining religion, and there is certainly no well-established or unified definition of religion. Instead, as I said, there's a range of different definitions that are presented. And I think for today, it's enough to think about these as falling within two camps, or at least along a spectrum across two poles. And they are inclusive, or what's sometimes called functional definitions of religion, and exclusive or substantial definitions. So functional definitions, inclusive definitions or functional definitions, they're typically broad and they focus on what religion looks like. So it might be certain kinds of behaviors or functions within society. So an example of one of those kinds of definitions is by Jünger here. He says that religion is a system of beliefs and practices by means of which a group of people struggles with the ultimate problems of human life. So that's quite a broad and encompassing definition. And using a definition like that, you could consider that actually secular humanism would fall into that category of religion. Other quite inclusive or functional definitions that look at rituals or behaviors might even go so far as to define football as a religion because of a common shared understanding of identity, rituals that are performed, common songs even, and concerns. But clearly, most people would not view football as a religion. And so on the other side of things, you've got more exclusive or substantial definitions that, as Aldridge says, define religion by what it is and not by what it does. And so an example of an exclusive definition here would be religion being an institution consisting of culturally patterned interaction with culturally postulated superhuman beings. So particularly most exclusive definitions look to define religion based on the inclusion of a god or some kind of divinity present there. And so I think it's important just to recognize that there's a spectrum here. And when we talk about religion, we need to know what kind of definition we're working with. For today, we want to just present this definition from Randy Haluza-Delay, who says that religion includes beliefs, worldviews, practices, and institutions that cross borders, time, and scale from the levels of individuals all the way to transnational and transhistorical movements. What I like about this definition is that it includes within it two spectra that are present. So the first is that religion is both inner and outer, so inner beliefs and outer practices, as well as individual and collective. So let's look at those two dimensions now. So the internal and the external dimensions of religion. Internally, we can think of religion as encompassing values, beliefs, ideologies, theologies, or worldviews. And I'll just focus here on worldviews for a minute because I think it's quite a helpfully broad and encompassing concept. And I like the work by Annick Hedlund de Wit, who operationalizes the concept of worldviews by looking at 5 dimensions of worldview. And let me just hint at each of those 5 and show how religion can really inform and shape those. So firstly, ontology, which is the nature of reality. What is real? And so many religious traditions would view nature as sacred and would believe that there is a divinity in reality. So it might be God or multiple gods as existing as real entities. And you can see here that's quite a different standpoint from perhaps secular materialism. Secondly, epistemology, so theory of knowledge. How do we know what we know? And many religious traditions would see as valid knowledge that comes from sacred texts or scripture. Third, axiology, which is about values, what really matters in life. Many religious traditions would talk about a good life as being defined or marked by simplicity rather than accumulation of material goods. Perhaps it is about service to others, compassion for others or for nature, and perhaps a life marked by generosity. Fourth, anthropology. This is the dimension of worldviews that gets at what it means to be human. What is humanity at its core? What's our identity? And many traditions would view humanity as fundamentally stewards of the natural world. But this is very much a dimension of worldview that has radically different stances, both between religious traditions, but also within religious traditions. And many would see humanity as having dominion or a permission to exploit nature as a sort of fundamental essence of what it means to be human. And we'll go into that in some following slides. And then fifth is this dimension of societal vision. What are we pursuing ultimately as society? And there might be some visions here from a religious origin that thinks about society as, at its best, it's a theocracy, so a kind of religious leader or a set of elites defining the way that society should function. Others might actually point to democracy as having a kind of theological or ideological rationale. Still others might view a kind of vision of society as religious organizations isolating themselves or cutting themselves off from the wider world. So you can start seeing very quickly that these deep internal dimensions are defined in many cases by religion, and I'm sure you can start thinking about the relevance that each of these standpoints might have on the ability to mobilize or to constrain action for sustainability. So that's the internal dimension. The external dimension of religion considers things such as religious practices, behaviors, rituals. So you can think about festivals that faith communities partake in, social norms that are defined within religious communities, perhaps things such as the importance of pilgrimage, like the Hajj, or the role of teaching about particular topics. There are then physical structures, the kind of materiality of religion within place. And so you might think about temples or church buildings, gurdwaras, all these physical structures as being expressions of religion. And then there are the institutional structures that religious organizations construct. So you can think about the Catholic Church in all its grand global reach as an example there. There's also the financial assets that religious organizations have, and the ownership of land. So it's not only those buildings. Many religious organizations own and manage land, and the way that land is managed has profound environmental implications. Okay, so that's the internal versus the external dimensions of religion. The second spectrum in the definition that I put forward is the individual versus collective dimensions. And so often in the West, we think about religion as a set of personal beliefs, but actually it's much larger than that. So individuals are embedded within communities, and these communities often meet regularly and define the way that families operate, as well as larger groups interact. And so they can shape cultures, societies, and even nations. So therefore, it's key that we understand, if we're thinking about sustainability transitions, we understand the historical legacies of these religious organizations and how power operates across these scales. In many cases, in many parts of the world, religious organizations are what's called anchor institutions. These are really key organizations that can act as gatekeepers to other parts of society and have great influence and are trusted within society. So you can see religion, therefore, is not a simple matter, and there's a lot of complexity, and we're going to try and dive into some more of that complexity in the coming slides. So Jens, you're going to look now at the relevance of religion for sustainability transitions.
Yeah, this is also a big question. So after having answered this big question of what is religion, now we are moving to the next big question of why religion is actually relevant for sustainability transitions. And here we are looking specifically at religious actors. So these can be religious leaders, religious organizations. In order to address this question, an iceberg model of society helps. In such an iceberg model of society, the material structures of society are just the tip of the iceberg. So the fact that material structures such as coal power plants exist in modern societies is related to the value basis of a society. This value basis lays much deeper. There are more and more sustainability researchers that say that it is not enough to just address the tip of the iceberg, so the material structures, in order to tackle the sustainability issues that we are today facing, but that we have to go much deeper. And going deeper means to promote cultural change. So there's a need for cultural change in order to address the sustainability issues that we are facing. Well, now you may ask yourself, who can actually promote cultural change? And there's one specific actor that is arguably well positioned to do that. This is religious actors. So religious actors can promote cultural change by influencing people's values and worldviews, as Chris has pointed out a bit. They can do this by disseminating pro-environmental values, for instance, in church services, in religious teachings, and so on. apart from promoting cultural change, religious actors can also do other stuff. They can promote political change and material change. When it comes to political change, they can use their public visibility and their close networks to political decision makers. In many countries of the global south especially, religious actors are often very credible in the public. So, for instance, in Latin America, religious organizations are the most trusted public institutions. People in Latin America tend not to rely or trust so much in politicians or the police force, and also not so much in researchers as us. They rather trust in religious leaders and religious organizations. And if religious organizations enjoy such a high trust and have a high public visibility, then they can use this as a resource to influence public debates on environmental issues and thereby influence political decision making. We have seen this with the example at the beginning when I talked about the Catholic Church in El Salvador. And finally, there's something that religious organizations can also do, similar to other organizations. They can promote material change. For this, they can draw on their infrastructures, on their land ownership, on their finances. So if you think about rich religious organizations such as the Catholic Church, they have massive material resources to promote sustainability transitions. So they can use these resources to invest their money, for instance, in sustainable investment funds and thereby materialize transformations towards environmental sustainability. So here you see three ways in which religious organizations can promote sustainability transitions. And there's a kind of mark around the cultural change. I have placed this mark in there because this is perceived often as something that perhaps not only, but mostly religious organizations and actors can do. So sometimes researchers argue it's something that is very specific to religious actors, while other researchers argue, well, it can also be done by other actors, but maybe religious actors are best equipped to promote cultural change better than businesses, politicians, or researchers. If we look at these three dimensions or three ways in which religious organizations can promote environmental sustainability, you see that there is really some power in this, and it may be argued that religious actors can actually be game changers when it comes to these transition processes. And with this, we are moving to the next slide. So now you may ask yourself, well, we have seen these nice resources that religions can use, but are they actually doing so? Are they really using these resources to promote sustainability? There are some researchers that say, yeah, this is happening. And these researchers suppose that there's a greening of religions. The greening of religions means that religions become increasingly environmental friendly. So religions become more and more friendly, environmental friendly in their readings of their scriptures. So they reread and reinterpret their scriptures and their values in a way that their worldview, their religious worldview and their values become more environmental friendly. And if this is happening, then this leads also to rising environmental activities of these organizations and communities. But this is only a hypothesis. So we do not fully know if this is true, and this is something that we are going to address now. But if this hypothesis is true, and if there's really a greening of religion and then rising engagement of religious communities in transitions, then these religious communities can actually contribute to accelerating the transition dynamics in broader society. Now, Chris will present some examples of the greening of religions to you.
Thank you, Jens. So yes, it is very much a hypothesis, but what evidence is there for such a greening? I'm just going to give you a few anecdotal data points that we can think about in this hypothesis. So firstly, there's a range of different faith-based declarations on issues of environmental sustainability. And just a few I've put up here on this slide. So we have the Islamic Declaration on Global Climate Change. There's Pope Francis's Laudato Si, which is the encyclical on the environment from coming up to 10 years ago. We have the Bristol faith commitments across a whole spectrum of different faith traditions, presenting the rationale as to why they should be moving towards environmental concerns. And then more recently, Faith for Earth, a UNEP program, published a call for action for interfaith and multi-faith action on the environment. So it appears when you're looking at declarations that there's more and more activity, and this would suggest that there is a greening occurring. In addition to those declarations, there's a range of different faith-based networks and initiatives that are growing in number and also influence at the moment. So we have organizations such as Green Faith, based in the States, but is international in its reach. We have Faith Invest that's working with faith groups to put their financial resources into funds that are more aligned with environmental sustainability. Parliament of World Religions has a climate commitments project, and the last couple of climate COPs have had what's called a faith pavilion, a distinct designated space for dialogue about faith and climate change. So there's lots going on. It certainly appears that there might be a greening occurring. And then finally here, there's practical action that is occurring on the ground, often in a grassroots level, in very particular geographical locations. So we have various different sites and structures of religious groups that are moving towards sustainability. So whether that be adopting low carbon forms of energy, conserving biodiversity on land. There's policy changes that institutions are making. So we've mentioned this a couple of times, but movements towards divestment of financial assets, political influence. So things such as a faith bloc present at different COP meetings to try and shift the dial and bring the voice of faith into that particular space, as well as what's quite interesting around sort of kinds of actions that are really distinct to faith groups. So a really interesting example of that would be Thai monks, Buddhist monks who some years ago, in response to threat of deforestation of a patch of forest, actually went out to ordain certain trees and confer on them a spiritual significance, which then actually led to the protection of those forests because of that spiritual action. So there's lots of really interesting actions, and we can talk more about some of those examples in the discussion later if that's of interest. Jens, you've got a case from Switzerland now that you'll present.
Now we have heard a lot of nice examples of the greening of religions. Thank you for that, Chris. And you may wonder, is this something systematic or is this just some nice examples? So is this a broader process occurring, or are we just picking some nice examples for the greening of religions? So we tried to address this question by conducting a systematic study of religious communities in Switzerland. And for this, we undertook a survey where we asked around 1,400 congregations in Switzerland about their environmental activities. So congregations are local religious communities such as a local Lutheran church or a Reformed church or a local Muslim community and so on. And we asked these communities whether they perceive a process towards more environmental awareness in their congregation in the last years. And actually, around a bit more than a third perceive such a process, which was a bit surprising for us. We did not expect to find a so high degree of greening in Switzerland. But when you look at different faith traditions, you see that there's some difference. You see that the Catholic and the Reformed are those that perceive this process to a higher extent than evangelicals or Muslims. And now you may think, well, it's perhaps because evangelicals and Muslims are just less interested in the environment and their faith traditions are less green, let's say. But we don't think that this is correct interpretation. The fact that specifically the Catholic and the Reformed are engaging a lot in this topic is related to the fact that they are recognized by the state. This means they are much closer to the state and to public debates. And when something like environmental protection or climate change mitigation becomes a very important topic in the public, then these churches may also engage in these topics. So they are more likely to follow trends. And the fact that they are recognized by the state leads them also to receive state benefits, which means that they receive church taxes that they can then invest in renewables and environmental friendly refurbishments of their organizations and so on. So it's not like evangelicals, Muslims, or other groups are necessarily less environmental friendly. It's just that these communities, the Catholic and Reformed, are more are supported by the state and more likely to follow social trends. Now you may ask yourself, what are these communities actually doing when it comes to their environmental engagement? And we have actually asked in a survey about this. So we asked for these 3 areas that I mentioned before: material change, cultural change, and political change. In total, 86% of the local communities that we asked, so of these 1,400, engage at least in one of these activities. But there's a strong focus on material change. So that means that religious communities are basically doing what most of societies also doing. 82% engage in at least one of the following activities: recycling, green energy, or renewables. So they show a very strong focus on structural changes, on doing what others also do in society, such as businesses or sports clubs and so on. When it comes to the specific area of culture change, which is very particular to religious organizations perhaps, then only 40% of the congregation states that they have organized religious celebrations with an environmental focus in the last 24 months. And most of these actually say that they have only done one celebration in the last 24 months when you ask them about the numbers. These celebrations are often a byproduct of regular activities, as we found out in qualitative interviews afterwards. So the cultural change seems to be not so much in a focus, and the political change is even less in a focus when it comes to the engagement in sustainability transitions. Only 50% of the congregations said that they engaged in public activities for the environment. This has to do with the fact that the political engagement of religious organizations is not very well received in Switzerland. So many politicians are strongly against the engagement of religious organizations in public political discussions. So what we see now, what we have seen is some evidence for the greening of religions, but the thing is not as simple as one may believe. Actually, the evidence for the greening is limited. So we see that there's some greening happening, but this is really a broad process that so that we can really speak about a broad greening in different religions. This is not so clear. What we see is that there's some activity, but this activity is often very limited. And we also see that the greening processes are not straightforward. This has to do with different complexities that we will now address. The first of these complexities is the tensions in religious communities. So often the engagement with environmental issues leads to tensions within religious communities, which then leads to a little religious engagement with environmental issues. A second point that we will address is that the engagement is often an outcome of social adaptation processes. And a third point that Chris will after that address is that religious actors can actually assume different roles in these processes. They may not only contribute to these processes, but they may also block transition processes. So now we will move to the first point, which are the tensions. So if you look into religious organizations that are engaging in greening processes and then undertake interviews, you will often hear about tensions. You will see that there are different positions regarding the role of religion in sustainability transitions. So there will be some people in these organizations that say, yes, we should engage in these topics. This is really important. This is also part of our religious identity. And others will say, yeah, we should engage because there's a social trend ongoing and we cannot miss this trend. And finally, there will be others that say, no, we should not engage at all with this topic. But even if most members of the religious community agree that there should be some engagement with this topic, then there can be still some disagreement about what form and level this engagement should actually assume. So should they just undertake some recycling activities and a bit of investments in renewables, or should they also go for cultural change and political activities? And to what extent should they do this? So should there be just some small activities, or should they really go out to the streets and protest against climate change? These are often intra-religious tensions. This means that these tensions are taking place within religious communities, but they may also assume the form of societal religious tensions, which means that religious communities that engage in these topics face tensions with broader society. This is, for instance, the case in Switzerland, when politicians react very critically to the fact that religious communities publicly protest for addressing climate change and try to engage in political debates about this topic. I have some examples from our study in Switzerland. Here you see some quotes from our interviews. Actually, we found examples of tensions in basically almost all the interviews. And here's, for instance, one interview from a religious umbrella organization speaking about other people, saying that these other people do not believe that it's the job of the church to deal with energy technology issues. But the job of the church is actually to proclaim the gospel. The second interview goes into the similar direction. There, the person itself speaks about its doubts about the engagement with these issues. This person says, well, it's basically not an important point for our community, but that our community should rather focus on a religious purpose, which is about the spiritual life of members. So you see that there are tensions ongoing around the greening of religions, and these tensions often lead these communities to not go so far in their greening activities, or sometimes also even decide for non-greening, meaning that there will be no engagement with sustainability transitions, or just a mild greening, which means a very low engagement, just engaging, for instance, with a bit of recycling. These tensions illustrate the general struggles of religion when it comes to trends in broader societies. So many trends in broader societies, the broader society around religious communities is always changing, and religious communities also always face the question of to what extent should we follow what is happening in broader society when the values and the ideas in broader society are changing. And that's actually something that we can see also in Switzerland when it comes to the greening of religions. Here we see that it's mostly a social adaptation process. Many of the religious organizations that we studied in this project were actually starting relatively late with their engagement with sustainability issues. So they started basically after the climate strikes in Switzerland became a broad topic. So it was shortly before COVID that this became a more public topic, and then religious organizations started to also tackle this issue because they started to perceive this as something important that they should also address. This then led to greening processes within these communities. So what was happening in broader society created transition impulses towards religious organizations that then started with the greening, with these internal processes. They started with tackling the questions of what should we do about this, and then they started to engage in some of the activities that I mentioned before. So some of these communities started to also to engage in protest and went out together with the climate strikes to protest for more more active climate measures in Swiss politics. So with these, you see that this is a mutual feedback process, actually. So broader society is creating transition impulses, which then leads religious organizations to create transition activities, which then can again accelerate transition processes in broader society. But the important thing here is that this greening process that we see and observe is mostly a path-following activity of religious organizations. So religious organizations mostly path-follow what broader society is doing in terms of sustainability transition. So they are mostly engaging in these material measures, and they are not so much innovators, for now at least, when it comes to these processes. But, and now I have to question this a bit. We see this in Switzerland, but this may be also different. Religious organizations may also assume different roles. They can be also pioneers of change and be really innovators, or they may also prohibit change. And that's something that Chris will now speak about.
Yes, so the debate that we've alluded to around the greening of religion is, are religious organizations greening or are they not? We suggest that a lot of that confusion lies in not appreciating the various different roles that religious groups can and do embody when it comes to sustainability transition. So as Jens has mentioned, religious groups can be pioneers, and we saw that example in El Salvador that we started this talk with, and there's plenty of other examples of this. Another example of actually it was Catholicism in Latin America was in Honduras, with a Catholic priest spearheading a protest movement against illegal logging. But there are a lot of times where religious groups will occupy what we've just called a path following role. And so Switzerland's a really good example of that, where essentially they are greening, but not necessarily leading the charge. And in many cases, following the direction that society is currently already on. There's a large constituency as well of religious organizations that are not even path following. They seem to sit apart from transition processes, and we call this role a passive observing role, or being passive observers. And so they will kind of keep to themselves and not necessarily see these matters as being of relevance to their organizations. And finally, there's a role of religious groups as prohibitors of action for environmental sustainability. What does that look like? Well, actually, let me just quickly go through. Maybe I'll skip over this because I've roughly given an overview of these different roles, but you can see here the definitions of those roles. Pioneers initiate change. Those that are path following adapt to change that's ongoing in broader society. Those that are passive observers and not actively participating in change, and those that are prohibiting change are actively seeking to block that. I'll just use a slide to outline what some of that prohibiting action can and does look like in different parts of the world. We might think about religious groups or pseudo-religious groups as becoming enmeshed in anti-climate politics or climate skepticism. This is most clearly seen in some of the religious dynamics in North America and the United States. And a good example of that is the conservative Christian body called the Cornwall Alliance, which is, as I say, it's a Christian organization, but it's effectively a political lobby group with its express purpose as being deeply skeptical of climate change, and making claims that environmental concerns are overstated, and promoting free market kinds of responses to this. And one of their initiatives is called Resisting the Green Dragon, which is trying to get conservative evangelical Christians to not be drawn into such environmental concerns. Another perhaps less sinister but very real concern or reason for prohibiting action is this I guess it comes out of a conservative perspective, but seeing divestment of financial resources away from fossil fuels and industry that is having a negative impact on the environment, to see that kind of divestment as fundamentally irresponsible and imprudent. And so so that is a major constraint there out of a kind of fiscal conservatism. And then third, there can be some really deeply held ideological or theological stances that are a challenge for environmental sustainability. One example within the Christian tradition, particularly certain Pentecostal traditions, is that of what's called a prosperity gospel. So seeing material wealth as a mark of God's blessing. In many other traditions, there are beliefs about the end times or apocalypse that is to come. And so climate change can, in that case, actually be framed as a mark or an indicator that we're entering such end times, and actually to be welcomed rather than resisted. And then finally, there's a theology present within particularly certain Abrahamic traditions that's sometimes called dominion theology, that rather than viewing humanity as stewards of the planet, actually seeing humans as being given permission to exploit and dominate the natural world and extract whatever resources we can from nature, because that is the way that God has set up the order of things. So you can see these are really problematic positions that religious groups can stand for. So to finish, I realize we've covered quite a lot of ground today. I think there are some really important and promising research directions within sustainability transitions scholarship as it pertains to religion. I'll just touch on a few of these here, and again, we can discuss those if we have time. So first, I think there's a real need for further research that looks at how religion frames or influences individual behavior change. This, I guess, can dovetail into a lot of the psychology of pro-environmental behavior, but often neglects some of these deeper influences of religious belief and ideology. And so that actually intersects with this growing field of inner transitions or inner transformations for sustainability. Second, there's the need for work that tries to explore new forms of governance partnerships for sustainability. So how can faith actors be brought into spaces of environmental governance in a way that they can be distinctly inhabiting that identity as faith actors, but also finding common ground to be able to work through these really difficult issues. Third, I think this prohibiting role of religion is deeply problematic, and so we need to understand that in more detail, and particularly around how such prohibiting roles can be overcome. Fourth, the importance, I guess, in the typology that we've laid out of pioneers through to prohibitors, there's a recognition that we need religious groups to be moving up that chain towards greater levels of ambition and action. And so how that change can happen, I think, is really important to investigate. Fifth, there are some really interesting religious trends that are occurring geographically. So we're seeing, particularly in Western Europe, greater plurality of religion through migration, greater hybridity of religion, so different morphing of beliefs and traditions. And actually, this is radically changing the religious landscape, which again shapes the cultural context in which these sustainability transitions need to occur in. And then finally, there's a lot of ethical considerations here when we start grappling with religion, and some challenges that we need to think about are around the instrumentalization of religion. So how do we avoid treating religious groups or being interested in them insofar as they can actually help further sustainability outcomes? So viewing them not as instrumental to that, but as valid participants in the process. The responsibilization of religion. So how do we grapple with contexts where religious groups might be pointed to as carrying a greater sense of responsibility, perhaps because of that moral role that they can function in society as. And then the invisibilization of religion. So in some contexts, religious actors are overlooked for various different reasons. And so they can actually be far more active in transitions than might be recognized because it's not seen through the lens of kind of secularism that dominates a lot of the scholarship. So some food for thought there. I really appreciate you listening to this, and Jens and I look forward to the conversation that we'll have just now.